The judge's face was a mask of shock and cold fury. He slammed his gavel down, and the crack echoed through the courtroom like a rifle shot. His voice was a low roar that seemed to shake the very walls. "Bailiff, shut every door in this courtroom. Lock them. This chamber is now sealed under the authority of the National Security Act of 1947. I watched as the color drained from the face of my brother Mark, a man whose smug confidence had always been his cruelest weapon. His triumphant expression melted into pure, uncomprehending terror. Beside me, my lawyer, Mr. Davies, a stoic man with the quiet intensity of the retired Marine he was, simply straightened his tie. Just 1 hour earlier, the stale air in that same room was thick with the suffocating weight of greed. My father, a retired Army colonel who had always valued volume over substance, had passed away. As his will was being read, the final, most valuable asset came up: the sprawling family estate and his entire investment portfolio. The executor cleared his throat and read the specific clause. The trust was to be managed and controlled by the sole heir who has demonstrated a distinguished career of service to this nation. I saw Mark, who'd spent 4 years as a supply clerk in the National Guard before opening a flashy car dealership, puff out his chest. He shot a condescending smirk in my direction. He was so sure, but then the executor spoke my name. Sarah Jensen. The name just hung in the air for a moment. Then Mark exploded from his chair, his entire body trembling with rage as he pointed a finger directly at me. "Her? She's no veteran, she's a fraud," he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. Behind him, a ripple of snickering went through my extended family, a familiar chorus of dismissal that had been the soundtrack of my life. The sound of it was sharper than any of his words. It was the echo of every forgotten birthday, every belittled achievement. Every time my quiet life was treated as a failure next to his loud one. "She pushed papers at a desk in Maryland for a few years and quit," he continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "It was a glorified internship. She has no honor, no record, and she has no right to his legacy." His words were meant to cut, to shame me into surrendering what was rightfully mine. I felt the heat rise in my face, but on the outside, I remained perfectly still. He thought he was just delivering another casual humiliation, another footnote in the long story of my invisibility. In that moment, he wasn't just my brother being cruel, he was a hostile party making a formal accusation in a court of law. And that was a mistake. He chuckled, basking in the laughter of his audience, thinking it was just another family joke at my expense. He had no idea he'd just committed perjury in front of a probate judge with a prior TSCI clearance of his own. To understand the legal firestorm that was about to consume him, you have to understand the oath I could never, ever talk about. To understand the oath I kept, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living. For my family, I was Sarah Jensen, the quiet one, the afterthought. They'd even given me a nickname that they thought was affectionate, but was really just a box to keep me in: the librarian. It was their shorthand for my quiet nature, my refusal to engage in the loud, performative drama they thrived on. They saw a boring government employee with a simple desk job. They had absolutely no idea who I was, or what I did when I went to work. They saw a footnote. While in another world, I was writing history. I remember one Thanksgiving, maybe 5 years ago. The memory is so sharp it might as well have been yesterday. The table was a battlefield of egos, and my father, a retired colonel who commanded every room he entered, was its supreme general. He stood, glass raised, his voice booming with a pride he reserved exclusively for my brother. "To Mark," he'd bellowed, who just broke the regional sales record at his dealership. Now that's the Jensen killer instinct. The family erupted in applause. I watched Mark, the family's golden boy, who wore his charisma like a shield, soak it all in. His success was tangible. It was loud. It was something Dad could understand. A number on a sales chart. Later, during a lull in the conversation, I made a rare attempt to share a piece of my own world. "Dad," I started, my voice barely cutting through the noise. I was just recognized for my work on the Crimson Spear project. I never got to finish. He just gave me a condescending pat on the arm, his attention already drifting back to Mark. "That's nice, honey. It's good you have hobbies. hobbies. In that single word, I didn't just hear his dismissal of my career. I saw the 10 years of money is tight when I needed a new laptop for my studies, followed by the down payment he proudly gave Mark for his first sports car. I saw the guitar lessons I begged for that never happened, and the expensive golf clubs he bought my brother the following Christmas. It was another achievement that was too quiet, too complex, and it just didn't fit the simple, loud narrative he'd written for me. Now picture a different room, a room with no windows, buried deep in the concrete heart of Fort Meade. This room was a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. There was no family, no noise, no judgment. The only sounds were the soft hum of servers and the clicking of my own keyboard. The only light came from a dozen monitors, painting my face in the ghostly green glow of cascading code and satellite imagery. In here, silence wasn't awkward. It was a sign of absolute focus. My quiet nature wasn't a social failing, it was a professional necessity. In this world, I wasn't the librarian. I was Echo. My commanding officer, General Thompson, a man who spoke little but saw everything, stood behind me, his hands clasped behind his back. His presence was a silent weight of expectation and trust. "Echo, talk to me," he said, his voice a low rumble. I never looked away from the screen, my own voice calm and even, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. "Sir, intel confirms the asset is compromised. We're seeing chatter indicating a kill team is en route. Their window is closing fast." I took a breath. "I'm initiating Protocol Onyx, rerouting their exfil route through the tertiary safe zone. They have a 90-second window, starting now." I didn't shout. I didn't panic. My fingers flew across the keyboard, each keystroke a life-or-death calculation made in a fraction of a second. In my family's world, I was invisible. But in this cold, dark room, my quiet focus wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon that saved lives. The very traits my father dismissed as hobbies or quirks were the same ones that allowed me to see patterns in chaos, to hear whispers in the static that no one else could. My success wasn't a number on a chart, it was the silent confirmation that a team of operators was coming home, unaware of the digital ghost who had just cleared their path through hell. They didn't know my name, only my call sign. And that was more than enough for me. I can still hear my father's voice from another memory, trying to explain his blatant favoritism to my mother. "Mark is a fighter," he'd say, "out there on the front lines of the business world. He needs my support. Your daughter's government job is safe, stable. She doesn't have the same pressures." The irony was staggering. He had no idea my front line was a firewall, that my battles were fought with algorithms against enemies of the state he couldn't even imagine. He saw a safe desk job because I couldn't show him the battlefield. He saw weakness because my strength had to be shrouded in secrecy. He measured my worth with a ruler that was useless in the world I truly inhabited. For a decade I had honored my non-disclosure agreement. I let them believe their narrative. I let them think I was the quiet, irrelevant librarian with a boring hobby. But in that courtroom, Mark didn't just question my honor, he questioned the legality of my father's final wish. He thought he was playing by the old, broken family rules. He was about to learn about federal law. As I expected, Mark's outrage quickly curdled into legal action. A few days after the will reading, his lawyer filed a formal motion to have me disqualified, citing insufficient evidence of a distinguished service record. Reading the document, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. For my entire life, I had been forced to fight my brother on his terms, in loud arguments and emotional confrontations where the truth didn't matter. But this was different. He had moved the battle from the chaos of our family to the rigid, logical world of the law. He had just made the fight a matter of procedure and evidence. He had brought the war to my home turf. My response wouldn't be an emotional speech, it would be a legal maneuver, precise and cold. I sought out a man I knew would understand, Mr. Davies, a retired JAG officer whose entire career was built around the unique legalities of classified personnel. In his quiet, orderly office, I laid out my situation. He listened without interruption, his eyes scanning the motion my brother had filed. When he finished, he gave me a single, grim nod. Our strategy was simple and, in his words, brutal. We would let Mark build his entire case against the ghost in my public file. We would offer no defense, call no witnesses, and say nothing at all. Instead, we would file one single quiet motion of our own, a petition, to submit sealed evidence for on-camera, judicial review only. In his office, Mr. Davies laid out the documents on his mahogany desk like weapons for a coming battle. "Here," he said, tapping a folder, "is your official DD 214 with every meaningful award, commendation, and operation title blacked out into oblivion. It's practically a blank page." He then pushed forward a second document. "Here is your signed Form SF 312, your lifetime non-disclosure agreement, a legally binding promise to stay silent." Finally, he slid a single, sealed manila envelope to the center of the desk. It was marked with a stark, red stamp. "And here," he said, his voice low, "is a letter from General Thompson. It is not addressed to the court, but to the judge himself, referencing your service under the code name Echo and the intelligence star you were awarded for Operation Nightshade. Mark is about to publicly accuse a ghost of being a fraud. The judge will not be amused." The trap was set. The brilliance of it was its passivity. We weren't attacking. We were simply placing a single, unassailable truth in a sealed envelope, and waiting for my brother's arrogance to force it open in front of a federal authority. He wanted proof. We were going to give the judge proofs so significant that the very act of revealing it in court would be a crisis. All my life, his loud accusations had drowned out my quiet truths. This time, my silence would be my argument. The motion was filed. The court date was set. Mark and his lawyer swaggered into the courtroom, armed with smug assumptions in my harmless-looking public file. They had no idea they weren't just walking into a probate hearing, they were walking into a skiff, and the judge was about to read them in. The courtroom fell into a deep, predatory silence as my brother's lawyer sat down. His closing words still hung in the air, unremarkable clerical work, not distinguished. I looked at my brother Mark. He was beaming, leaning back in his chair with an insufferable grin plastered across his face. He caught my eye and gave a slow, deliberate wink to our cousins sitting in the gallery behind me, who all nodded in smug agreement. I'd seen that wink 1,000 times. It was the wink he gave when he got the car I wasn't allowed to borrow. The wink he gave when Dad announced he was paying for his MBA. The wink that said, "Sai win. You lose." This is just how the world works. I felt nothing, just a profound, cold stillness. They were all watching a play they thought they knew, but the final act had been rewritten. My lawyer, Mr. Davies, stood slowly. The room's attention shifted to him. He didn't approach the judge or consult any notes. He simply adjusted his tie and spoke in a calm, clear voice that cut through the silence. "We have no rebuttal, Your Honor. We rest our case on Exhibit C, submitted for your private review." A quiet murmur went through my family. Confusion, disappointment. They expected a fight, a desperate, emotional plea. They didn't understand that the battle was already over. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with a weary expression, walked to Mr. Davies's table, took the single sealed envelope, and began the long, slow walk to the bench. Every one of his footsteps seemed to echo in the vast, silent space. The judge, who had been looking thoroughly bored by the proceedings, took the envelope with an air of mild annoyance. He slid it open with a letter opener, looking more like a man opening a utility bill than a legal document. He pulled out the single sheet of paper inside and began to read, his expression one of pure bureaucratic indifference. And then, it happened. It wasn't a sudden gasp. It was a slow, undeniable transformation. First, his posture straightened, the bored slump vanishing as his spine went rigid. Then, his eyebrows shot up high on his forehead. He blinked several times, his eyes scanning the page again, his lips moving silently as he reread the words. The bored bureaucrat was gone. In his place was a man who understood, with sudden and shocking clarity, exactly what he was holding. He was holding my real life. He placed the letter down on his desk with a deliberate, almost reverent motion. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly, and put them back on, never taking his eyes off the page. Finally, he looked up, but not at the lawyers. He looked directly at me, and for the first time in my life, in a room full of my own family, I felt seen. Then he turned his gaze to my brother, and his voice, when it came, was stripped of all judicial pleasantry. It was cold iron. "Mr. Jensen," he began, "in my 20 years on this bench, and my prior 12 in the U.S. Attorney's Office with full security clearance, I have never seen a commendation like this. Your sister's service is not undistinguished." He picked up the letter again, holding it as if it had immense physical weight. "Her commanding officer confirms she was the lead SIGINT analyst for a joint special operations task force." The words echoed in the stunned silence. Mark's grin had frozen on his face, a grotesque mask of disbelief. "The work she did on something called Operation Nightshade is credited with..." The judge stopped himself abruptly, realizing he was on the verge of a serious breach. He looked back at me, and this time his expression was one of unmistakable, profound respect. "The details are not for this record," he said, his voice softening slightly. "Or for any of you." Then the iron returned to his voice, harder than before, as his glare fell upon Mark. My brother looked small in his chair, all the swagger and bluster gone, replaced by a pale, sickly fear. "Your frivolous contest and your slanderous accusations in this public forum have put this court in a perilous position." The judge leaned forward into his microphone, and his voice suddenly boomed. Through the courtroom speakers, a physical force of pure authority. "Bailiff, shut every door in this courtroom, lock them. This chamber is now sealed under the authority of the National Security Act." A collective gasp came from the gallery. Mark's face was now the color of ash. He started to stammer, a pathetic gurgling sound, but the judge cut him off with a slice of his hand. "You stood in a court of law and accused a recipient of the intelligence star of being a fraud," the judge said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Contempt of court is the least of your problems right now." My brother finally understood. He hadn't been fighting his quiet, invisible sister. He had picked a fight with the United States government. And he had lost. My father had spent my entire life teaching me about the importance of rank and reputation. In the end, it only took one sealed letter from my brother to learn who in the family truly had both. Once the courtroom doors were unsealed, the silence that followed was heavier than the judge's gavel. He dismissed my brother's claim with extreme prejudice, a legal term whose brutal finality was not lost on anyone. Mark was then slapped with a severe fine for contempt of court, and given a chillingly direct warning about the federal crimes associated with attempting to solicit or expose classified information. My family, the same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had been snickering an hour before, filed out past me with their eyes fixed on the floor. They scurried away like mice, their shared arrogance shattered, leaving only a pathetic, cloying shame in its wake. They couldn't even look at me. In the end, Mr. Davies simply turned to me, his expression unreadable but for a flicker of intense pride in his eyes. He gave a single, crisp, respectful nod. "Well done, ma'am," he said, and that was all the validation I needed. 6 months later, I was standing on the front porch of the family estate, a place I had always associated with suffocating obligation. But now, it was quiet. It wasn't a prize I had won, it was a responsibility I had earned, a sanctuary I was slowly reclaiming from the ghosts of the past. I had begun the long process of turning it from a monument to my father's rigid, narrow ego into a place of genuine peace. The dark, heavy curtains were gone, replaced by ones that let in the morning light. The air no longer smelled of old cigar smoke and polish, but of fresh paint and brewing coffee. The transformation was slow, but it was mine. The heart of this new reality was my father's old study. It had been his command center, a place of dark wood, leather, and self-importance. Now, it was my home office. I had sold the massive, imposing desk and replaced it with a simple, functional one that faced the window, looking out over the grounds. And on the main wall, where a larger-than-life, uniformed portrait of him used to hang, there was now a simple, framed satellite map of the Hindu Kush mountain range in Afghanistan. It was a silent, personal nod to the work I did, to the life I had led in secret. It was my history, finally given a place of honor. One afternoon, my phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a text from a former teammate from my unit at Fort Meade, a man I hadn't spoken to in months but with whom I shared an unbreakable bond. The message was simple. Hey Echo, burgers at my place this weekend. Thompson is in town. You in? My call sign. Seeing it there, on the screen of my phone, in the quiet of my new life, felt more real and more affirming than my own name had for years. A genuine smile, slow and unfamiliar, spread across my face. These were the people who knew me, the real me. This was my family, forged not in blood and obligation, but in silence, trust and shared mission. I typed back my reply, the words feeling easy and right. Affirmative. I'll bring the beer. Later that evening, a single email sat in my inbox. The subject line was just my name, Sarah. It was from Mark. I clicked it open, a part of me braced for a final, desperate attack. But the message was short and pathetic. I'm sorry, it began. I don't understand any of it. They're investigating my dealership's government contracts now because of what the judge said. It's a mess. Can you help me? I read his words, searching myself for any familiar sting of anger, or even a flicker of triumphant satisfaction. I found nothing, just a quiet, calm finality. My peace was no longer a fragile thing that could be threatened by his chaos. His approval, his understanding, none of it mattered anymore. The ledger was closed. The accounts were settled. My life was finally my own. I moved the cursor over the reply button and typed one single, solitary word, no. I hit send, and then, without a moment's hesitation, I blocked his email address forever. I closed my laptop, picked up my coffee, and went back to the porch to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple. I was finally home, on my own terms, and I was at peace. My brother believed a legacy was a trophy to be won in a shouting match. I learned a true legacy is a silent duty, and the only acknowledgement that matters comes from those who understand the mission. If you've ever had your quiet competence dismissed by loud incompetence, share your story of vindication below. In this community, your service is always recognized.